Welcome back to another edition of The Antidote, where we're turning the tables on your media landscape. This is Greg McCarran.
This is Jeremy Roth-Cushel.
Real quick before we get into our primary topic, which in a way will be a follow-up on some of what we discussed last week with Trump and Henry Kissinger and the what was known as the MAGA group, where we laid out our theory on what might be going on there. I think we'd be remiss if we don't talk about briefly about a couple of the major topics going on right now. And the first one is the aftermath of this event in Florida on Valentine's Day at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, of course, in Broward County. Real quick, do you have any thoughts you want to share on some of the aftermath of it, or some of the narratives that are taking place in the media in the aftermath of it?
Yeah, just quickly, I think that it's important right now for people to dig into the core of what this actually was. And more, a lot of the indicators are that this does represent something like an escalation of the kind of American Gladio events that we've been talking about, there being a danger for escalation of, in the last year. Las Vegas is still hanging out there and clearly was one example in many ways of that people should go back and look at that. Some of the data on the ground there points to that whatever happened there probably happened in the floors above the hotel where they said it was, and the top four floors of that hotel were actually a Four Seasons hotel that was owned by a combination of a Jewish Zionist Canadian billionaire, and then had a Saudi prince, and then Bill Gates buy into that more recently. So people should go back, look at Las Vegas, and then also now in Florida, there is a lot of indicators here that this is an escalation of American Gladio. Talked about the idea of the Palestinification or the Gazification of America. I found an interesting Eureka Encyclopedia article called West Bankification that talks about the escalation in the post 9/11 world of the coordination of the U.S. military and the Israeli military, and increasingly the Israelification of U.S. military relationships, stance, strategy in relationship to the Arab and Muslim world. And the last thing is, I think people should take a look at some articles by Yoichi Shimatsu that are exclusive to rents.com. There are some factual issues in here and assertions that are maybe a little bit overstated, but really there's an immense amount of data in here that people should follow up on that speak to some of the what's actually might have happened here at this school down in Florida. And just recently there was a teacher on the TV who said that she saw what she thought, what the shooter, and he was in full metal gear with bulletproof vests, masks, and all this type of thing. And this Shimatsu article goes into a couple of different connections to both Army intelligence. This psychologist of Nicholas Cruz was an Army intelligence psychologist with a background in neuron control systems, had worked for NASA amongst other groups in the government. And then also Shimatsu talks about this in addition to the close Chabad situation here surrounding not only Sheriff Israel, but others involved in this, that there's this a group called Shomrim Vigilantes, which is basically an ultra-Orthodox sort of civil policing group Jewish policing group, where there's actually a sort of like a no snitch policy at some level. In New York City, they've apparently been involved in standing down reporting of potential child abuse, sexual abuse type of situation. So this should be all looked into. We'll link these articles and ask people to go dig into this data.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that real quick on that topic, I think that for me, something that really concerns me is just the ramping up of the use of whatever you want to think about certain characters that have been in the media since this event, that have been promoted in the media. People who went to the school, in some cases, may not have gone to this school in Florida. Either way, how you look at it, the use of young people, non-adults, of young adults, children, and teenagers to promote these agendas. I mean, it's been out there before. We've seen it a little bit after Sandy Hook, but now it's escalated to the point to where I think it's becoming an extremely dangerous tool, and that now anytime when you start to involve non-adults, young children, and teenagers in propaganda efforts for whatever that is, and in this particular case, it's the effort of so-called gun control campaign. It's extremely dangerous, and I think that it's a very, very, very bad sign. So I think we will probably revisit this topic again in the future, but I think this is a very troubling and dangerous sign. And honestly, in some ways, and we might go back to this in the future, what I'm seeing from the other side of the coin with the right-wing reaction to this really isn't any better, but we can revisit that another time. And
Greg, I think that's a very important point that you talked about, the way that the young people are being sort of put forth in front and center, especially in terms of the mass media component of the wake of this thing. And like you pointed out, that there's some issues with the way that aspects of the right are responding, where they're sort of focused on these teenagers and that type of thing. And in the midst of that, I would call for the adults in the room to revisit what this actually was. And so I have seen some potentially positive moves where there's beginning to be a focus back onto Sheriff Israel, what happened in relationship to his role in all of this, and a very interesting article that speaks to the deep background of the idea of destabilization campaigns around the world in relationship to shootings, snipings, these types of things, is an article that I found by Gerard O'Coleman, who represents a strong left perspective, and I think people should go look at that. It's titled "Unknown Snipers and Western-Backed Regime Change," to actually get a sense of how pervasive the usage of shooting incidents really is in relationship to undermining, destabilizing, overthrowing governments all around the world. And so then the question is, has this come home to roost in some way?
Great point there. I'm glad you brought that up. We will link to that Gerard O'Coleman article for sure. It's a great article on the history, some of the recent history of how snipers have been used as forces of destabilization in countries that pose a threat to whatever agenda is being carried out by various power interests. So that's a very good article. We'll link to it in the in our episode description when we post it on YouTube. But real quick before we get into our primary topic, I did want to mention this another major story, and this is very interesting in light of Netanyahu's recent troubles, is the announcement by the Trump administration. It appears to be an official announcement. I haven't heard any pushback from Trump or any other officials, and it's also been corroborated by the Israeli government. It seems that all of a sudden the process of moving this embassy to Jerusalem, it looks like the official sort of the official type of I guess you might call it dedication or whatever, is going to happen on May 14th, which is the 70th anniversary of Israel, the recognition of Israel by the United States, by the UN. And this is Netanyahu's invited Trump to come to Israel for this. And I think what this appears to be for me, I think we take into context everything around Trump, the media network that got him elected, the hard right-wing Zionist leanings of so many people around him, that this does appear to be the reaction of Israeli leaders to this, everyone from Netanyahu to Ron Dermer to the Danny Danon, the Israeli ambassador, I believe, to the UN. This is signifying that it does appear that Trump was the candidate to bring about what these people, this perception, this vision for this hard right-wing Zionist kind of combination of evangelical Zionist Christians and Jewish Orthodox Zionists of this messianic vision for Israel based on the, I guess, combination of Old and New Testament prophecies. So I think this is very significant. It's going to be interesting to see how this plays out, because this is just, I think this is very big in terms of global and the global consequences of this happening, if it does happen on Israel's Independence Day, the anniversary of the Palestinian Nakba. So this is very significant, I think, and I'm sure we'll revisit this. But I think the significance of this happening, if it does happen on Israel's Independence Day, I think is very important. So.
Yes, and before moving on, I just want to say that the article that I would direct people to look at in relationship to Florida is titled "Commando Strike in Parkland is a Polygon Puzzle," and there are some very interesting pieces of this in relationship to that story that sort of receded from the press after apparently being debunked about Cruz being part of the Republic of Florida, and how the ADL was the key to that story. And so there's some interesting stuff about the timeline of that suggests that the ADL actually completely constructed that from the inside out. So people should go take a look at that, I think.
Thank you. Indeed. And so I'm sure at some point we're going to revisit all of these topics here in the near future. But I guess our primary topic today is going to be in some ways a follow-up on what we discussed last week. I think it fits into what we discussed last week with this analysis of Jerome Corsi's comment on Henry Kissinger basically being in some ways kind of a mastermind of behind Trump's foreign policy and this shift away from the Obama administration's Middle East policy and shifting it in a direction that is, I guess, more friendly to the right-wing Zionist entities that Trump and his administration represent. I think in some ways this will be a follow-up to that. I want to start out before we get into, because I know you have some articles that you've identified that we've kind of looked at that I know you want to, a few articles you want to read from that I think are very insightful and provide some very important information as to the real quote-unquote RussiaGate scandal. I do want to mention that the Fitzpatrick Informer has put out a great article. It's just a compilation of a lot of various articles and other type writings that have come out in the last couple of years documenting, I think, as this article is titled, I think this is the real Trump dossier as far as the real evidence, the real facts of what exactly Donald Trump's connections are to elite criminal networks. And it's just so much far more than just the generic media narrative that Trump and Putin are colluding to undermine American democracy. So I think this article, we're probably going to go through a few of these articles, maybe analyze a couple of the articles featured in this dossier, but the real Trump dossier, this is an excellent compilation of articles and writings that I think show the real Trump scandal that people should be focused in on, rather than just making this into a wild goose chase about Putin and Russia and spy versus spy that ultimately really goes nowhere, and I think just doesn't do any service to anybody.
Yes, and it's titled Trump Dossier 2018. At fitzinfo.wordpress.com, and we'll link to it. And I think you're right. This is basically anybody who in your life or anybody online that you speak with who believes that the extent of the so-called Russia collusion investigation is basically some Facebook posts and a few memes or something like that, and that it's a big nothing burger with a lot of super hype sauce on it. Direct them to this, and I'll just quote from the very beginning of it. It says, "There is no secret or Democratic Party created Trump dossier. All the treasonous dirt on Trump is in plain sight and freely available. here is some of that dirt. It will be updated as new information becomes available. And it's just a rich source. For example, it starts with the Who Towers Behind Trump, which I believe is the Michael Collins Piper article. Then there's one titled Trump's Mobbed Up, McCarthyite Mentor Roy Cohn. Then another one, Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein Rape Lawsuits and Affidavits, Trump and Cohn, Trump, Epstein, and Bill Clinton. Is Trump a populist or a pro-Zionist spoiler? Trump is the swamp. Trump's Jewish elite mafia and the five dancing Israelis. Dope Inc., 1978 book, delves into Trump's Resorts International, its intimate ties with organized crime, the CIA, the Mossad, and the international drug trade. Donald Trump picked Felix Sater, convicted stock fraud felon, as senior business advisor. AP and courts records say former mafia-linked figure describes association with Trump. And then finally, in just this single section, Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner host Talmudic Sabbath at their new home with their new Chabad Rabbi Levi Shem.
Wow, that's a lot of information right there. And I wonder, just within the population, how many people even know a lot of those names that were mentioned in that article, who think they're experts on RussiaGate and have all this proof that Trump colluded, or they have all this proof that RussiaGate's a, quote, nothing burger. I just wonder how many people will actually know about these entities, and that's why a real dossier like this is so important to get out to people.
Yes, and later on, towards the end of our recording here, we will talk about why it is and what are some of the data points about people across the entire political spectrum, especially in relationship to aspects of the alt-right, the new right, that the sort of MAGA set from that crew, but also the people who are supposedly against Trump from the left, who are still clinging to
the hashtag resistance.
And even beyond them, in terms of people who are legitimate journalists on the left, such as Glenn Greenwald, for example. All right, legitimate, but talking basically sort of undermining that there's nothing there by basically not looking at all this open source data, and then we'll eventually tie it right back in, supposedly, to sort of the more resistance associated set that clings to the newest article from the New York Times in relationship to Trump, and why that might be more of a PR, a public relations, cover-up operation than a resistance or exposure operation. But before we get into that, I do think that this is a follow-up in some ways to last week's antidote about mega Trump, Kissinger, these types, this whole array of facts. And there's a very interesting article called "Trump is Puppet of Kissinger, CFR, and Rothschilds, the True Architects of Russian Collusion." It's at conspiracyschool.com by David Livingston. It's David Livingston's blog. And then it goes through some of the resonance in the background there. And then down here, it basically talks about how even in the Financial Times, when it shows this 6 successive bankruptcies that Trump was bailed out by Russian crime lords, it then says, quote, "However, what the mainstream media is not exploring is their ties to Henry Kissinger, the CFR, and the Rothschilds. Quote, I don't doubt that the Russians are hacking us," unquote, Kissinger told CBS's Face the Nation in an interview that aired December 18th, 2016. Quote, "And I hope we're doing some hacking there, but it's very difficult to communicate about it because nobody wants to admit the scope of what they're doing," unquote. In the same interview, Kissinger described Putin as a character out of a Dostoevsky, and said, quote, "And he is a man with great sense of connection, inward connection to Russian history, and he sees it," unquote. And then moving down there, the last paragraph of this first part of this article is interesting. Quote, "Sputnik reported that Kissinger was advising Trump on how to, quote, bring the United States and Russia closer together to offset China's military buildup," unquote. According to Paul Craig Roberts, who was Kissinger's colleague at the Center for Strategic and International Studies for many years, this tells us that Kissinger is trying to use better relations with Russia in order to separate Russia from its strategic alliance with China. As Roberts explains, quote, Kissinger is aware of the pro-American elites inside Russia, and he is at work creating for them a, quote, China threat, unquote, that they can use in their effort to lead Russia into the arms of the West. If this effort is successful, Russia's sovereignty will be eroded exactly as has the sovereignty of every other country allied with the U.S., unquote. And then from there, it even goes into the background of Kissinger, former KGB agents, such as a Colonel Michael Golanowski, even said that Kissinger had been recruited by Soviet intelligence during World War II. So there's a lot here that should be looked into in relationship to what is this key role that Kissinger is playing in relationship to Trump and the policy that is being sort of put forth in relationship to what Jerome Corsi asserts was the role of people above Israeli intelligence in getting Kissinger into the mix here.
Yeah, for sure. And the Kissinger is very in the realm of like all of the major figures who constantly get mentioned as being like never Trump. Kissinger's name never comes up in those circles. And I mean, so that's, I think, very significant. And I thank Jerome Corsi for giving us that little nugget of information to follow up on whether we're correct, not that it's mega group. He's definitely given us something. So I guess in that regard, we have to thank him for unintentionally doing us a service. So.
Yes. And so then moving back into this question about Trump and what is the substance of this investigation into Trump, and let's make the investigation much bigger than the Mueller investigation. Let's talk about this investigation as we, the people, doing an investigation into what the heck is going on in our countries and in our politics. So in order to orient us into what this actually represents, this Russia investigation, and I would assert that a lot of the problems of the people who are either overemphasizing aspects of the election part of this or underemphasizing the collusion or counterintelligence aspects of this is that they're confusing different it's basically a sector analysis error. And that, one part of this has to do with elections being rigged and hacked in many different ways, but another has to do with psychological operations, information warfare, propaganda, counterintelligence, and then a third part has to do with the idea of agents, material collusion, and compromise. And so let's delve in there. There's an article called Compromat that is also by David Livingston. The subtitle is Trump, Hollywood Sex Parties, and the Russian Oligarchs, Part 1. And I'm just going to read the first part of it. The oligarchs. Trump's legal defense is in part funded through a Republican Party account with a number of rich donors, among whom, the Wall Street Journal reported, is Ukrainian-born billionaire Sir Leonard Len Blavatnik, who is part of a web dirty money sex, Russian oligarchs, and Hollywood moguls that lend support of the claims of the infamous Trump dossier. Blavatnik is close to Oleg Deripaska, a close ally of Putin who has been denied entry into the United States due to alleged ties with organized crime. According to Forbes magazine, Deripaska is Russia's sixth wealthiest man with an estimated fortune of $13.3 billion. Deripaska has been closely connected to the Kremlin since he married into Boris Yeltsin's family in 2001, which literally includes him in the Russian clan known as the family. I believe there's we've referred in the back previously to this idea of mishpucha as I believe, which is also family, which is a Jewish reference to Russian mob or the Jewish mob in general. Back to the article. In 2010, the Financial Times published a story exploring Deripaska's business relations with Sergei Popov and Anton Malevsky, alleged heads of Russian organized crime groups. In 2000, Deripaska and Roman Abramovich created a partnership and founded Rusal, the largest aluminum company in the world. Abramovich is the primary owner of the private investment company Millhouse LLC and is best known outside Russia as the owner of Chelsea Football Club, a Premier League football club. In their 2004 biography of Abramovich, the British journalists Chris Hutchins and Dominique Midgley described the relationship between Putin and Abramovich as like that between a father and a favorite son. Abramovich was the first person to originally recommend to Yeltsin that Putin be his successor. Abramovich and fellow oligarch Lev Levayev would go on to become Chabad Lubovich's biggest patrons worldwide. Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump are also close friends with the wife of Roman Abramovich, Dasha Zhukova, who is a friend and business partner of Rupert Murdoch's ex-wife, Wendy Dang. Dang is also one of Ivanka's closest friends and a friend of Carly Kloss, the longtime girlfriend of Kushner's brother Josh. Deng was rumored to be dating Putin, which she has since denied. All of them were guests in August 2016 on media mogul David Geffen's $200 million yacht off the coast of Croatia, and a few weeks later at the U.S. Open. Zhukova reportedly attended Trump's inauguration as Ivanka's guest. Okay, a few last paragraphs here. As early as 2005, Trump's former campaign manager, Paul Manafort, secretly worked for Deripaska on a confidential strategy that he would influence politics, business dealings, and news coverage inside the United States, Europe, and former Soviet republics to, quote, greatly benefit the Putin government, unquote, the Associated Press reported. According to the AP, starting in 2006, Deripaska made annual payments of $10 million to Paul Manafort through the Bank of Cyprus. Who else is associated with the Bank of Cyprus, Greg? Isn't that Wilbur Ross or no?
It could be. It could be. I know that there's a Wilbur Ross connection to a lot of those mafia interests via the common connections they had in bailing out Trump interests, particularly when Wilbur Ross was working with Rothschild Inc. But it might be Wilbur Ross. I'd have to look into that.
Okay, we'll check back into that. To the Bank of Cyprus to advance Putin's global agenda. Manafort told Deripaska he was pushing policies as part of his work in Ukraine, quote, at the highest levels of the U.S. government, the White House, Capitol Hill, and the State Department, unquote. During the 2016 presidential campaign, less than 2 weeks before Donald Trump accepted the Republican presidential nomination, Manafort, via Konstantin Kilimnik, a Kiev-based operative with suspected ties to Russian intelligence, offered to provide briefings on political developments to Deripaska, though there is no evidence that the briefings took place. Blavatnik, who was named Britain's richest man in 2015, founded Access Industries, which now owns Warner Music Group. Blavatnik is a longtime business partner of Viktor Vekselberg, who is one of the richest men in Russia and has close ties to the Kremlin. Blavatnik and Vekselberg hold their 15.8% joint stake in Deripaska's Rusal. Blavatnik also sponsors Kolel Chabad, the oldest continuously operating charity in Israel, founded in 1788 by the first Lubavitcher Rebbe Shneur Zalman of Lialdel. A source close to Blavatnik said, quote, he is very Zionistic, unquote. During the 2015-2016 election season, Blavatnik contributed a total of $6.35 million to Trump and the political action committees for Mitch McConnell, Marco Rubio, Scott Walker, Lindsey Graham, John Kasich, and John McCain. Blavatnik donated another $1 million to Trump's inaugural committee. So that's the last part that I'm going to read from that article. Greg, any comments on that?
In regards to the Trump inaugural committee, it's very interesting to hear the names that pop up as being these major contributors. Like Sheldon Adelson gave the most to any inaugural committee in history. This donation of $1 million by Mr. Blavatnik, and of course people like Lou Eisenberg, September 11th Port Authority key player in the transaction of properties, was also on that inaugural committee. And that, to me, that signifies that, you keep hearing, well, all the elite Zionists were opposed to Trump. Well, no, they weren't. And this is just more proof of that. And I'm glad you're bringing up this connection here. David Geffen, another elite Hollywood type who Trump's probably had good relationships with forever, just out there in the shadows, hanging out with Jared and Ivanka and their Chabad criminal mafia buddies. So.
Yes. So there's a second part, another second article titled Compromat by David Livingston under subtitled Trump, Hollywood Sex Parties and the Russian Oligarchs. I'll read the first part of this one. Trump, their boy. While Trump was running for president in late 2015 and early 2016, Felix Sater, who was then a broker for the Trump Organization, wrote a series of emails to Trump's personal counsel, Michael Cohen, in which he promised to engineer a real estate deal with the aid of Putin. But that never materialized. Sater expected the project would highlight Trump's deal-making skills and boost his pursuit of the candidacy for president. Sater said he had lined up financing for the tower with VTB Bank, which is 60.9% owned by the Russian government, was under American sanctions for involvement in Moscow's efforts in the Ukraine. Although Trump has denied knowing him, Sater appeared in photos with Trump and carried a Trump Organization business card with the title, quote, "Senior Advisor to Donald Trump," unquote. Sater had already served time in prison for stabbing a man in the face with the stem of a margarita glass. Sater pled guilty in 1998 to one count of racketeering for his role in a $40 million stock fraud scheme involving the Genovese and Bonanno crime families. Sater also served as a government informant on the mob in mysterious matters of national security, including by providing, quote, "significant intelligence with respect to nuclear weapons in a major country openly hostile to the United States," unquote. In 2014, Sater was named Man of the Year by Chabad of Port Washington, New York. The award was presented by Sater's rabbi, Shalom Paltiel, Port Washington Chabad's founder, who is also close to, quote, Putin's rabbi, unquote, Beryl Lazar, calling Lazar, quote, "my dear friend and mentor," unquote. Paltiel explained the award was partly in response to a closed-door meeting he was invited to attend with Sater at the Federal Building in New York, where dozens of intelligence officers from many agencies praised Sater as a, quote, "national hero," unquote. Cohen, whose wife is Ukrainian, has maintained a relationship with Trump for many years, operating in New York commercial real estate. According to the Dossier, Cohen's wife is of Russian descent and her father a leading property developer in Moscow. The Dossier also reported that a Kremlin insider asserted that Cohen met secretly with several Russian presidential administration legal department officials in Prague in August 2016. The source went on to identify leading pro-Putin Duma figure Konstantin Kosachev, chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, as having possibly participated in the meeting. Its purpose was to clean up the mess caused by revelations of Paul Manafort and Carter Page's dealings with the Ukrainians and Russians. Cohen agreed to contingency plans for various scenarios to protect the operation, but in particular what was to be done in the event that Hillary Clinton won the election. In an email to Cohen on November 3rd, 2015, referring to the time when he helped arrange a trip that Ivanka took to Moscow in 2006, Sater boasted, quote, "Michael, I arranged for Ivanka to sit in Putin's private chair at his desk and office in the Kremlin. I will get Putin on this program and we will get Donald elected. We both know no one else knows how to pull this off without stupidity or greed getting in the way. I know how to play it, and we will get this done. Our boy can become president of the USA, and we can engineer it. I will get all of Putin's team to buy in on this. I will manage this process," unquote.
There you go. That's interesting you mentioned that, and that it appears that when Manafort was removed from the campaign, like that was kind of a double. I think maybe there were two sides to that. Number one, kind of perhaps a damage control in case anything really bad came out in that process. And also it was a way to get the Mercer, Breitbart, Bannon, CNP crowd in there to take over the campaign and really shift it to where they could put the final touches on selling Trump to that massive conservative base out there. So but what it shows is that this involvement is nothing new, that these people close to Trump like Paul Manafort we're working with Russian interests for years in conjunction with these interests that are all around Trump in his entire business career, that this is nothing new. That's just did not start with Trump deciding overnight that he wants to run for president as a puppet for Vladimir Putin to try to undermine America and give Russia more influence over American affairs. This is a long-running, in many ways, criminal operation here, and this is even more proof of that. And the fact that it's just so been blacked out is it's so important to zero in on all of this for all of these reasons. And so this information that you're identifying in these articles, I think, is vital, and it is proving that this is nothing new. This is a long-term operation here.
And before moving on to another article that actually speaks to how long-term this is, not only did this start before 2014 or when Donald Trump announced in 2015, but this actually goes way back even before Felix Sater's time in relationship to the 2000s. And it actually probably goes back to the 80s even. And so we'll touch on that next. But just the next section of this article on Compromat by David Livingston actually goes into the dirty part of the Trump dossier, and we'll let that be for now. But it makes some interesting assertions about some of the investigation about who Source E in the dossier is, apparently being a Boris Epstein, who was was an advisor to the Trump campaign, who apparently has confirmed to some journalists, I imagine, of this aspect of the dossier. So that's an interesting thing to be dealt with. But leaving that aside for now, we're going to move on to an article that we referenced before that had been published in Veterans Today a couple weeks ago, called Revelations: Donald Trump's Russian Connections, the Russian Report. And it turns out to be a referencing long-term intelligence reports from inside of the Soviet sphere. And after talking about how that Soviet intelligence and aspects of Czech intelligence even were interested in Donald Trump when he married Ivana, actually, who was Czech, it then goes into some more recent aspects. Okay, so we'll wade in here. Trump has never filed for personal bankruptcy, but his hotel and casino businesses were declared bankrupt 6 times between 1991 and 2009 in order to renegotiate debt with banks and owners of stocks and bonds. Because the businesses used Chapter 11 bankruptcy, they were allowed to operate while negotiations proceeded. Mr. Trump was quoted by Newsweek magazine in 2011 saying, quote, "I do play with the bankruptcy laws. They're very good for me," unquote, as a tool for trimming debt. Then it goes over the 6 bankruptcies. Then down here's a section that talks about how old this relationship is, this influence relationship, what might be called in intelligence circles, they're trying to recruit him in certain ways, but they're also laying the groundwork for potential recruitment of some sort or material compromise or influence. Okay, Donald Trump has pursued business deals in Russia since 1987 and has sometimes traveled there to explore potential business opportunities. In 1996, Trump trademark applications were submitted for potential Russian real estate development deals. Mr. Trump's partners and children have repeatedly visited Moscow, connecting with developers and government officials to explore joint venture opportunities. Mr. Trump was never able to successfully conclude any real estate deals in Russia. However, individual Russians have invested heavily in Trump properties, and following Mr. Trump's bankruptcies in the 1990s, he borrowed money from Russian sources. In 2008, his son Donald Trump Jr. said that Russia was an important source of money for the Trump businesses. In 1996, Mr. Trump partnered with Liggett Duquette, a small company, and planned to build an upscale residential development on a Liggett Duquette property in Moscow. Trump commissioned New York architect Ted Liebman, who did the sketches. In 1987, Mr. Trump visited Russia to investigate developing a hotel. In Russia, Mr. Trump promoted the proposal and acclaimed the Russian economic market. At a news conference reported by the Moscow Times, Mr. Trump said he hadn't been, quote, "as impressed with the potential of a city as I have been with Moscow," unquote, in contrast to other cities he had visited, quote, all around over the world. By this time, Mr. Trump made it known his desire to build in Moscow to government officials for almost 10 years, ranging from the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, they first met in Washington in 1987, to the military figure Alexander Lebed. Moscow's mayor, Yuri M. Luskov, showed Trump plans for a very large shopping mall to be located underground in the vicinity of the Kremlin. The mayor complimented Mr. Trump's suggestion that this mall should have access to the Moscow metro, and it was eventually connected to the Okhotny Ryad station. Although the 1996 residential development did not happen, Mr. Trump was by this time well known in Russia. Between 2000 and 2010, Mr. Trump entered into a partnership with a development company headquartered in New York, represented by a Russian immigrant, Felix Sater. During this period, they partnered for an assortment of deals that included building Trump Towers internationally, and Russia was included. For example, in 2005, Sater acted as an agent for building a Trump Tower alongside Moscow River with letters of intent in hand, and, quote, square footage was being analyzed, unquote. I'm going to skip ahead here. Sater had also traveled to Moscow with Mr. Trump, his wife Ivanka, and son Donald Jr. Mr. Trump was associated with Tawfiq Arif, formerly a Soviet commerce official and founder of a development company called the Bayrock Group, of which Sater was also a partner. Bayrock searched for deals in Russia while Trump Towers company were attempting to further expand in the United States. Mr. Sater said, "We looked at some very, very large properties in Russia on the scale of a large Vegas high-rise." Then I'm going to final section. I'm going to skip ahead here. A secret KGB memo under date of February 1st, 1984, concerned the necessity of making an expanded use of the facilities of cooperating foreign intelligence services, for example, Czechoslovakian or East German intelligence networks. The most revealing section concerned Kompromat. The document specifically requested any compromising information about Donald Trump, including illegal acts in financial and commercial affairs, intrigues, speculation, bribes, graft, and exploitation of his position to enrich himself, plus any other information that would compromise the subject, Trump, to his country's authorities and the general public. Naturally, the information could be used to cause him serious problems in his country if exposed. Finally, the report mentioned that his attitude towards women was also of interest. The point of interest would be if he was in the habit of having affairs with women. Mr. Trump's first trip to Moscow came after he found himself seated next to the Soviet ambassador Yuri Dubinin in 1986. His original position was Soviet ambassador to the UN. Dubinin's mission as an ambassador was to make contact with America's business elite. There was a luncheon held by Leonard Lauder, the son of Estee Lauder. Mr. Trump was invited to meet the ambassador. Ambassador Dubinin spoke fluent English, and during the course of the luncheon, Trump spoke at length with the ambassador, who proposed that Trump build a large luxury hotel directly across from the Kremlin in association with the Soviet government. Okay, so this goes on and on and on and on. And what this shows is that there is, contrary to either those who are sort of supporting Trump from the MAGA side of things, or those on the left and journalists who basically just point to maybe the documents that have been released by Mueller's indictments, or what's been released by aspects of the mainstream media, to basically say, well, there's nothing there in relationship to Russia stealing the election. But meanwhile, if we were not to commit that category error of confusing the difference between election rigging or election influence and individual influence of actually cultivating a long-term asset, then all this open source information begins to show how Trump shows himself to be some type of long-term cultivated man of interest by not only Russia, of course, but also this Russian Jewish oligarch circles that tie very much directly back in Trump's backyard into Chabad Lubavitch, but then back into Israel and Tel Aviv.
Yeah, and it should also be noted that Leonard Lauder, the son of Estee Lauder, I believe, is the brother of Ronald Lauder, the head of the World Jewish Congress, who is the most outspoken pro-Trump supporter as far as from a global Jewish advocacy group. So I think that's very significant as well. And Lauder appears to figure into the elite mega group at some level. So I think that's worth pointing out. It's also interesting how the mention of Trump's behavior towards women, the way he conducts himself. And it's interesting with a lot of the media, the way they shape Trump and the sexual allegations and all this. And a lot of this is stuff that could be impossible to prove, and therefore you could just dismiss it as though, Trump's just an alpha male. That's just how he carries himself. He doesn't actually carry he doesn't actually follow through on anything he does. But it shows that Trump could easily be compromised with the perception of the type of person he is towards women, and that this type of perhaps compromising of him, even if he's guilty or not guilty of certain things. For example, this rape allegation by I believe a 13-year-old girl at the time, which never got any type of mainstream publicity outside of a couple of articles in the back pages of newspapers, which were gone within a day or two. It shows that Trump as a long-term asset has also had his sexual, at least the way he publicly conducts himself towards women, has long been used as a way to possibly to control him or to build his brand and simultaneously build his image, and also to control him in the terms of where who's behind him and what kind of strings might be getting pulled behind him at some levels.
Yeah, and at the same time, too, a lot of these people who were connected and continue to be connected to this Epstein case that is continuing and ongoing are people who show themselves to be key media supporters of Donald Trump, such as the so-called liberal civil rights lawyer Alan Dershowitz, who's very much tied into this Epstein case, or even people like I believe Alex Acosta, who was brought in to head up the labor department, I believe. And then also there's Ken Starr, who's also intimately involved in this, and who was just actually recently mentioned in a long piece written by Monica Lewinsky, having met him for the first time and him giving a very knowing, mysterious smile to her about that whole.
Well, how heartwarming is that? How touching is that?
So, in moving on here, there's a very interesting couple paragraphs here in another Akamai Tree article titled "The Political Outsider Deception," and "political outsider" is in scare quotes, as it probably should be. A recurrence throughout American presidential history has been the promotion of bogus, quote, political Washington outsiders, unquote, by hidden powers whose purpose is to restore confidence in the American federal government among a certain large sector of the population. Do certain things, be they executive or legislative, that an already established, stigmatized politician would have trouble convincing the public to agree to do, and or to manipulate presidential elections. Donald Trump is without a doubt an example of this. Other examples from recent history include Ross Perot, Barry Goldwater, Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, and Ronald Reagan, among others, all in some way highly connected to the CIA intelligence community, Eastern establishment, etc. Anyone even vaguely familiar with Donald Trump's unwashed background and past, if they're honest, knows that he is about as far from a political outsider as anyone could get. Trump was raised at the knee by two of the most powerful and politically connected people in New York, his father, Fred Trump, and Roy Cohn. Fred Trump, himself the son of whorehouse and opium den operator Frederick Trump, was a Brooklyn, Queens construction and real estate magnate specializing in lower and middle class housing, who was at the nexus of political power in Brooklyn. Fred was a member of the infamous Democratic political machine Tammany Hall, along with his friend and prominent Zionist Bunny Lindenbaum, the Madison Democratic Club, and the elitist New York informal organizations Knights of the Round Table. His connections extended beyond Brooklyn, reaching clear up to the mayor of New York, Abe Bernie, Roy Cohn, Bunny Lindenbaum, legendary publicist Howard Rubenstein, remember that name for next story, Assembly Speaker Stanley Steingut, well-connected bureaucrat Michael Balkin, various New York area mafias, among others. Fred utilized these extensive connections to procure preferable government treatment, mostly from the Federal Housing Authority, for himself and later Donald, in the form of subsidies and lucrative no-bid contracts, not to mention bailing Donald out several times. Then it goes back into the background of Cohn and Hoover, CIA, all of these types of things that we've spoken about before. But last thing I want to read here is Clearly, given Donald's intimate association with the two people discussed above, as well as his later association with people such as the Clintons, Rudy Giuliani, Jack Abramoff, Rupert Murdoch, Carl Icahn, Roger Ailes, Adnan Khashoggi, George Soros, etc., his admitted role as a political paymaster, business ties with intelligence, CIA, Israel, Mafia, Resorts International, Trump Building, Harris, Trump Plaza, etc., and generally favorable treatment from government, nearly $1 billion in subsidies, the unprecedented recommendation of a casino license for Trump, he is not in any way a political outsider. The various people behind his campaign are further proof of this. The Trump campaign is composed of a legion of national security spooks and sophisticated right-wing operatives, John Birch Society, Council for National Policy, American Security Council, Nixon, Reagan, Bush proteges, the most prominent of which being James Woolsey, Joseph Schmitz, Michael Glassner, Roger Ailes, Steve Bannon, a former naval spook connected to money laundering and drug trafficking, Roger Stone, Edwin Meese, Felix Sater, and Paul Manafort. Peter Thiel, the vocal Trump supporter, spook venture capitalist co-founder of CIA-backed data mining company Palantir, Bilderberg steering committee member, and bankroller of the Hulk Hogan-Gawker lawsuit, is another member of this cast, although apparently less directly involved. Of course, this could be explained away as the establishment co-opting Trump, but given his background and history, I find this highly unlikely. In addition to this, there are numerous informal advisors not officially part of Trump's team, one of which is likely CFR President Richard Haass, who Trump held a secret meeting with Trump in August of 2015 when his campaign was just getting off the ground. Many other formal and informal advisors, such as Edwin Meese, are coming from the powerful Council for National Policy, which threw its weight behind Trump in May of 2016, at least making it official. All evidence suggests they were in on Trump from the beginning, after holding a secretive meeting between themselves and all major GOP presidential contenders at the time. So finally, given the fact that Donald Trump is not a political outsider, that brings us to the question of why he's been labeled by almost the entire media a political outsider. And that in turn takes us to the political outsider deception, which the media is the key to. In fact, it is nearly impossible to overstate the media's role in bolstering Trump and the Trump deception.
So that excellent article, and that is just so on the money. And what was needed, you needed the outsider for the Republican conservative base to get behind. And unfortunately, Donald Trump was perfect for that conservative base. But I'm going to tie this in with about 7 minutes left to our last topic here, real quick. It mentioned that article talked a lot about the Council for National Policy. And it's really interesting to look at the Council for National Policy as being not only the shadowy right-wing group that really shapes a lot of, Republican GOP conservative policy from behind the scenes, but also as being the primary network of individuals, of organizations, kind of, I guess, a nexus, you would say, between this shadowy, ultra-right-wing Council for National Policy and these proponents of a hardline Zionist right-wing Zionist policy, as being the kind of the kingpins behind the efforts to expose the Clinton family for well over 20 years now, going back to the early 90s. And you're seeing the same nexus of these CNP connected operatives. And there's very much an influx, very much of what's the term I'm looking for here? A correlation between CNP operatives and these hard right Zionist operatives. And many of the same names that were at the forefront of exposing the Clintons 20 years ago, groups like Judicial Watch, people like Joseph Farah and his media network, which of course is involved in the WorldNet Daily, with people like Jerome Corsi being keys within shaping the InfoWars narrative. The whole Bannon, Breitbart, Mercer network, which is kind of evolved from the Richard Mellon Scaife network of financing right-wing operations. These have been the primary movers and shakers in really digging deep and putting out all this heavy information on the Clinton family and their criminality, whether you go from the more generic kind of exposés of Clinton criminality as far as Clinton cash and the connections of the Clinton Foundation to global criminality, to even the more conspiratorial Clinton body count, which has really become a major talking point within the whole InfoWars, more conspiracy-oriented community of this right-wing network. Yeah, this was very hot and heavy, and this evidence against the Clinton family was so prevalent and was so deep in so many ways. Now let's look at the flip side of it, the so-called anti-Trump media. And one of the things that I had some confusion about was determining, yeah, well, it does appear that the establishment press really is opposed to Trump. And even I'm starting to reassess that belief. And there was an article that you alerted me to that was published that I think really indicates just how the establishment media in so many ways has been portrayed as being so anti-Trump, which, by the way, was the key, I think, to Trump's victory, was portraying Trump as the outsider, anti-establishment who's just hated by everybody who's on the quote-unquote inside. This article, we'll post the link to it, but it was Maggie Durante. It was drawing parallels between the famous New York Times propagandist of the Soviet era, Walter Durante, and a current top New York Times Washington correspondent, Maggie Haberman. And in this article, it delves into how, for all of the talk that the New York Times gets for being the voice of the anti-Trump media, the primary voice, that really Maggie Haberman's articles on Trump inside the Trump White House have not been all that really hard-hitting when it comes to the actual evidence that's out there against Trump. And it turns out that Maggie Haberman has direct connections to Mr. Rubenstein, who you mentioned earlier, the New York City PR guru, who's closely connected, who was, I should say in the past tense, but continues to be through his family, closely connected to Trump, as well as his partner in crime in so many ways, Rudy Giuliani. But it's interesting looking through this article and a breakdown of how many times Maggie Haberman in her articles over the course of a couple of years mentioned Clinton Benghazi, for example, as compared to Trump and Mafia, Trump and Sater, Trump and Soho, and the real properties and the real acquisitions that Trump and dealings that Trump has done over the years, which point to complicity in a criminal network of mafia interests, of elite Zionist interests. And I guess in her articles, Haberman has mentioned Clinton and Benghazi over 90 times, as opposed to maybe 2 references to Soho, no references to Sater, very little in her articles about Trump and these real provable open source mafia criminal connections. So I think that we'll link to this article, but I think it really speaks volumes on how you had this right-wing operative network really going after the Clintons hardcore, and the media that has been portrayed as being so anti-Trump has not zeroed in on any of Trump's real provable criminal complicity and criminal connections. I think that we'll share this article. I think it speaks volumes as someone like Maggie Haberman and what she represents in the New York Times, possibly in general.
Yes, and people should also go look back at the Akamai Tree article from last week, Sidestream Media, the backstory, and the first couple paragraphs actually talk about the sort of the controlled sidestream right-wing media in many ways, and then that fits very much in with this article that you are talking about now, posted on Medium by Jay McKenzie. Maggie Durante, is the New York Times repeating its history of enabling apologists for corrupt regimes? And after talking about this history from the 20s and 30s, I believe, of the New York Times basically covering up the Holodomor and the constructed, starvation of millions of people in relationship to the Soviet regime. It then gets deep into who is this sort of like main so-called, if you think about the fake right media talking about the New York Times, you would think about things like, oh, the commies. But meanwhile, their history is, of course, covering up some of the most major communist crimes in many ways. And so then that apparently continues on, this idea of covering up the crimes of criminal regimes continues on to the current moment. And you brought in some about this, Maggie Haberman, and I'll just read this last thing in our last half minute here. It's the money, honey. Nancy Haberman, Maggie's mother, works for the PR firm Rubenstein, which was founded by Howard Rubenstein, a PR legend who was once called the, quote, dean of damage control, unquote, by Rudy Giuliani. At Rubenstein, Nancy Haberman is no coffee girl, so it goes into her background. And so skipping down, as for her PR firm's history with Trump, well, that's a deeper dive. Howard Rubenstein's working history with the Trump family began early with Fred Trump, Then in 1990, when Donald and Ivana were going through their divorce, Rubenstein took on Donald's personal PR, doing the dirty work of spinning that nasty mess into something that wouldn't tarnish Donald's name and brand irreparably, because that's the real nature of PR, isn't it? The brand. So people should go look at this and look at specifically at those the word count numbers in terms of how little Maggie Haberman has brought up Seder and the mob ties, and how much she's focused on Clinton's emails. So until next week, keep digging, people. Antidote.
All right. Till next time.
We out.